All right. This video's purpose is to teach you a little bit about a new paradigm for healing and health. And before I get into the science and the nitty-gritty details and all of that, I got to tell you a little bit about what my overall purpose is in life and with the work that I'm putting out here. And that'll lead into why I'm also talking about how to heal the body. And so I would say that my journey really started at birth, like everyone else's, or even before that. But where I first became fully aware of what my purpose was in this planet with this work was when I was 16 years old. I was at something called an enlightenment intensive, where for 7 days straight, you sit and you do inquiry practices. You do something called dyad. And through this method of inquiry, I was able to take my mind out on a limb far enough out to where I had a breakthrough, where I dropped the mind, where I entered into what many would call an enlightened state. And in that experience, there was this absolute knowing of who I was, fully and completely. And it's something that you can only directly experience. It's not something that I can put words to, for the words would only distract you from your own discovery that you experience when you come to the end of inquiry. And you could inquire on just about anything, and we'll get into that more later on. But I was specifically inquiring into the question, who am I? It's what I spent 7 days doing to get to that enlightened state. And in that enlightened state, I thought to myself afterwards, when thoughts resumed, that even a moment of that, even 10 seconds of that, was worth an entire lifetime worth of effort, or many lifetimes worth of effort, work, whatever it was. I knew then, I was like, that is the one thing that I want to get back to. That is the thing that I want to experience for longer and longer periods of time. It's so beyond amazing. It's just this ineffable experience that I literally can't put words to the quality of it. But it was so powerful that it guided me ever since. And so my mission quickly became that I wanted to do whatever it took to deconstruct, to take down the layers of my ego so that I could experience that enlightened state for longer and longer periods of time, if not just live in that state. And I wanted to be able to help other people to do the same, to be able to have their own breakthrough, to be able to take down the layers of the onion so that they could get to the core of their experience. And I deeply believe that enlightenment is just a natural state of being. It's not something that needs to be mystical, far off there, out of reach, out of grasp, as it oftentimes is portrayed or experienced as. Really, that type of thinking, it just puts that experience further and further out, which makes it less likely for you to experience it in the moment. And so, if enlightenment is our natural state, our natural way of being, and that's my sort of deeper purpose and goal here, then why am I working with illnesses, symptoms? Why am I giving you guys a new framework through which you can see your health? Well, I'll start from the beginning. So, you might start off in an enlightened state. That might be your natural state. But then what happens is you have ego to decide who you are and what the world around you is, right? It starts to get definitions. I am this or I am not this. It starts to take those on pretty early in life, right? Because you're born into a world where there's other people living from their ego. There's other people that are in separation. They're not in their natural state. And you might even say that we live in a world that's pretty far removed from what our biology is made for, right? Our biology is maybe made for living a more biological life, living more in nature, living more in alignment with the world. Everything else in the world has this synchronistic ability where it's all connected and taking care of itself. Nothing lacks in nature. All systems, species, whatever, they all feed into each other to keep the whole thing going. right? Whereas humans, we've removed ourselves from that deep connection to nature and living in a natural way. And so when you're born into a world of other egos, you start to form one yourself. You start to form an identity. I am this or I am that, right? Identity is anything that you overlay over top of your experience that isn't the direct and total complete experience of the truth of who you are, right? So enlightenment is just directly experiencing you. That's why so many spiritual teachers and teachings say you already are that which you can become. You already are the enlightenment that you seek. And any of the suffering, the pain, the illness, all of the torment that people experience in the human condition, it's all based off of not being who you really are. Right. And so we start to form these identities. We start to form these core beliefs about who we are and what the world is. And this makes up our perception of self. It makes up our perception of the world. And from that space, we then start to develop our personality, our interests, our dislike, everything of that sort. And you could say that a big part of what does that is maybe you're in that enlightened state. Maybe you're in that natural state as a baby. Maybe that's why they feel just this, like they have this field of love, this bliss, just this amazing energy around them, right? And then there's certain conflicts that happen, which a conflict you could say is anything that's kind of upsetting, but the type of conflicts that I'm speaking to in this video, in some of my deeper work, is biological conflicts. So they're conflicts that are unexpected. You know, there's a definitive moment of like who you were, what you believed about yourself, your viewpoint of the world, what that was before and after that conflict. There's a distinct change that happened. So it's a very specific event. It's a sudden event, meaning you didn't see it coming on. You weren't prepared for it. You didn't know it was going to happen. And the third qualifier for this conflict shock, as it's sometimes called, is that you were alone. It was unsupported. Maybe you didn't have what you needed to be able to deal with it. And so we live in this world now where everybody's individuals. They're not living amongst tribe. They're not living amongst a greater community. It's just between you and your biological parents, usually, maybe a sibling or two, maybe only one parent, right? And so a biological conflict would be something of that nature, those three factors into it. But then it's something that registers, and it registers in you at the level of the psyche, the brain, and an organ simultaneously. That's what creates a conflict shock. And the reason I'm telling you about this is because we have these early on, anywhere from 3 to 6 to 7. There's not an exact number, but we have these early on conflict shocks. And they're not necessarily the capital T trauma that we would think of. That's what I'm trying to get to here. Sometimes it's as simple as you're a baby and your mom leaves the room. She goes somewhere else and you don't know when she's going to come back. Maybe you've rolled over and your face is against the floor and you're not strong enough yet to get yourself up. So you feel like you can't breathe. That could be a biological conflict shock that happens. And the way in which you perceive that event, are you bad and that's why mom left you? Is it a conflict of separation? She's gone. You want her to be closer. Or you want to separate from the floor that feels like it's suffocating you, but you can't. How you perceive yourself in the world in the moment of that conflict is what determines how that event affects your psyche, brain, and organ. And it shows you how it's going to show up as an illness later on, or as a personality trait, or as something that you're interested in. That's the point that I was kind of trying to get to is we have these early on conflict shocks that then make up our personality. They help to form those beliefs and that identity, and we see the rest of life through that. And so you might be thinking, I have tons of conflict shocks, and that's probably true, but I would suggest, and this is just my own thoughts, this isn't any specific teaching or anything. It's just my own viewpoint. But I would suspect that the conflict shocks you have later on in life, after the age of 7, they're perceived through your core conflict shocks and the identities and beliefs you formed in early childhood. Mm. The other tricky thing about that is you haven't fully formed your own personal identity. That's why you're starting to form it, right? In that 0 to 7 age. And so some of what you're perceiving or the information you're taking in to create this ego, to create this identity, it might be information you're taking in from your mother, possibly your father too. To me, just having done a lot of sessions and looked at a lot of people, it seems more common to be connected to the mother, but you definitely get it from both, right? And that's maybe where science tries to describe that with genetics or epigenetics or various things like that. But it's all about the lens through which you're perceiving it, how that's registering, how that's landing for you. And so, what I was going to say to tell you a little bit more of my story is I had certain conflict shocks early on in my life that made it so that I was seeking spirituality, that I was seeking answers, that I would be interested in those sorts of realms, right? And maybe luckily so, right? Because that eventually led me to that experience at 16 with the Enlightenment Intensive and then moving into deeper and deeper spiritual work. And so I was doing all sorts of spiritual studies to try to find an answer, to try to figure out how to deconstruct this shell that ego's formed so that people could live an enlightened, peaceful life where they feel loved, seen, protected, whole. And I found a form of intuitive energy work or intuitive development work. And the guy who was teaching that, Lewis Bostwick, he said that somewhere around, maybe not an exact quote, but he said somewhere around 98, 99% of illnesses is psychosomatic, right? And he's not the only person who said that. There's been many spiritual teachers, like Louise Hay, for example, that have seen physical ailments, symptoms, illnesses, and found an emotional, energetic, spiritual root cause. And that's great. That's how it works, right? There's this spiritual root cause. There's this thing that happened, and it's not the event that hurt you. It's not the trauma that hurt you. It was your resistance to it and your perception of what it meant about you and about your world. If you were in total non resistance, total acceptance, just fully present in each and every moment of your life, in that deep sense of knowing who you are, then you wouldn't have to pull information from your environment, from your family, from your ancestral line. You wouldn't have to try to form your own identity, your own sense of self, right? Because you would be in that state of knowing who you are, which isn't an intellectual thing. It's not, I know my name. No, it's a very deep experience, but also a completely natural experience that's available to everyone, right? And so that's just something that's important to remember because some people think, well, my life wasn't that traumatic or, I had it pretty good. Sure. But these things, they register at a very subtle way sometimes. And it's more about how it's registering in your body and in your psyche than it is to the legitimacy of the trauma or how other people would view it. You know, it was your time to be learning and discovering who you are. And these moments, they had an impact on you. And then they made you susceptible to how you would interpret everything else down the line, right? You have these other conflict shocks, you have these other traumas, bad experiences in life, and you view them through the lens of your original conflicts and the personality, beliefs, identity that you structured from those original ones. And similarly, if you were fully present, fully non resistant, fully in the moment, then even the ones you already had, they wouldn't matter, right? You wouldn't be feeding any energy into them. All your energy would be going into the spirit that you are. It would be going into the truth of who you are. And so, even in those moments of conflict that come up, there would be no resistance. You would see them all through the light of truth, which would eliminate suffering. It would eliminate this hanging on to it that then creates illness, right? But since we're not all um, totally enlightened, totally present, totally non-resistant, um, we would have to find those conflict shocks and resolve them. And that's what I was getting to with my story is I was very interested in spiritual work, and I did it since I was 14, 15 years old. I became a Reiki master. I started studying at a spiritual school, did shamanic training, did all sorts of trainings, everything under the sun, literally anywhere from 1 to 4 times a week since I was 16 to today, more than 12, 13 years later, uh, been doing them. And spiritual work is amazing and it has taken me so far. And I truly believe that your own awareness and intuition is the greatest tool that you have. It's your greatest asset to be able to heal, to come back to your own enlightenment, all of it, right? It's through the intuitive process of self inquiry, turning the mind in on itself, that I was able to have my first breakthrough. And again, I'll get into the inquiry stuff more later on. But my point being, all that spiritual work was amazing and it did so much for me, but I still had these underlying conflicts that came up. And so there was still some pretty significant blockages within my life at this core level that felt like it kept pulling me out of my enlightened state. It kept pulling me back into these old patterns, old way of seeing things, these old identities that I knew weren't true. I know who I am, but yet they're still in motion. They're still functioning. And this became even more and more apparent to me maybe a year ago. I had a sort of narcissistic trauma bond relationship. And it wasn't even a super long relationship, really, but it ended in kind of a turbulent way that was really painful to me. And most of the pain wasn't even just that relationship, it was all of the experiences that came before it that it reflected. And of course, the original core conflict that is basically my core conflict was all stirred up within that. And so I had done all the spiritual work. I had done everything I could to heal, every mold protocol, parasite protocol, injecting thousands of dollars of amino acid peptides, worked with all sorts of naturopaths, functional medicine, everything you can think of, spending tens of thousands of dollars a year trying to cure the things that I was feeling because it was getting more and more severe. And I had this breakup in a traumatic way that brought me back to square one. I was so sick in so many ways that they tried to give me 3 different diagnoses for chronic, uncurable, allegedly illnesses. And it was so severe, I was actually eating a feeding tube diet. It was like feeding tube enzymes that came in a container that I would drink. Didn't have to be in the hospital for it per se, but I was rejecting every other food so much that that was the only thing I could take in for a while. And I lost like 25 pounds, severely sick, felt like I couldn't work. Everything was falling apart. And I was like, where's all this spirituality to save me? What's going on here? Why am I still stuck in this, brought back to square one? And so I essentially said a prayer. I was like, all right, show me the root cause of all of this. Show me what true healing is, which true healing is, of course, coming back to that state of wholeness, being the spirit that you are, not having these conflicts active, being in a state of rest, repair, homeostasis, wholeness, whatever you want to call it. That's what it is. And the root cause is these psychic wounds, these spiritual wounds, these conflict shocks that affect, again, the psyche, the brain, and the organs simultaneously. And they were able to prove that doing it was either 40 or 80,000 brain scans. Dr. Hammer, who came up with something called German New Medicine, which is part of what I'm talking about here today, he had a similar thing. His son was killed in this weird accident where he was on a boat. And after his son was killed, he got testicular cancer. And the story goes something of the lines of he was like, why would that happen to me? A healthy, successful doctor suddenly has testicular cancer. And so he would do case studies to see everybody else with testicular cancer, what happened right before that. He's like, instead of what person has what illness. He's like, what illness has what kind of person? And he saw that they all had this loss of a child before getting testicular cancer. And so he started to do these thousands and thousands of case studies where he looked at every illness, every symptom, and he would find that they all had the same, depending on the illness, they all had the same conflict that happened right before the person got that. And so, in essence, he discovered that illness isn't some random thing that's happening in your body. For so long, religion and medicine and all sorts of things, they want to blame it on something, right? Religion, it might blame it on your sin. It might blame it on, a demon, an entity that's in there, this, that, the other. Whereas medicine wants to blame it on some foreign invader, some virus, some bacteria, whatever the case is. They've both been trying to blame these outside forces in their own ways, through their own lens. And in truth, all of the symptoms that you're experiencing, these so-called illnesses, is actually a special biological program that's running, meaning it's your body adapting to what's being perceived as a threat, what's being perceived as a loss, a conflict, whatever. The body's not doing something random, it's doing something very specific. The conflict registered in the psyche, it registered in the brain. The brain goes, okay, we got to adapt. We got to be able to survive. It's doing it in a very literal way, as if you were living in nature and something happened in nature. In nature, if there's something you need to separate from, like say a venomous snake, you're just going to separate from it. You're going to go and move away. Boom. There was the conflict, but it was resolved really quickly. And that's why you see a lot of those people in native tribes being really healthy into their early hundreds, late 90s, whatever the case is. Um, there's a few reasons, but one is they resolve conflicts more quickly because it's also literal. That's how our biology, our body, our psyche, even certain components of it that are less evolved, like that lizard brain, that limbic brain, that part of us, it's very literal like that. And so, A, they resolve conflicts quickly and in a practical, real matter. And B, they have community. So it's not going to be isolating when the thing happens, usually. So a lot easier to heal from. People want to blame it on the diets that they eat or see, it's all about the food or the medicine or the toxin load when they look at people in blue zones. No, look at their life conditions, look at their social conditions, right? You'll see that they resolve their conflicts easier. And so that's kind of the gist of it, right? He discovered a lot more than just that, but there's a lot of other people out here that talk about German new medicine, and they go into much greater depth as to the science of it. And it's actually cool to hear about the science. It helps convince your mind, and it shows you that your body's not attacking itself. It's not doing things at random. It's all an adaptation for your own survival, right? What I was trying to say is the snake, right? Separation. You just separate it from the wild. Here, we perceive something as dangerous, might just be your boss yelling at you that you want to separate from. And then you're not able to separate from because you have to keep going to work. Well, your psyche brain organ is still responding to that as if there's a real threat there, and it's going to create a specific symptom. Separation has to do with the skin. There might be a breakout of your skin somewhere. Very generalization of it, but that's how it would be happening. And so we have all these things, again, based off of our core identity, that helps us to perceive things as conflict. It helps us to have this resistance to it, this certain perspective of how we're interpreting our experience that then creates this symptomology, which is your body adapting. And then when you resolve the conflict, you leave and you don't have to work for that boss anymore. Your body goes into a healing phase. That's when people feel sick. They feel symptoms, fever, swelling, whatever the case may be. And most people then try to take some sort of medicine. They try to do something that sometimes just interrupts the body's healing process. It interrupts you from going back to that state of restoration and healing that's natural to you, right? And when you're in that healing phase, that's when you might test positive for mold, for parasites, whatever bacteria is in there, and they're going to blame all of that. But those are all the cleanup crew. All of those systems, all of those organisms, none of it's bad. It's all there for a special purpose. It's cleaning up whatever's in there that needs to be removed now that your body can heal. Now that it's not adapting to the threat, it's now restoring itself back to normal. And sometimes it restores itself back to where you're in a stronger state, right? Because naturally, if you continuously were exposed to a threat, your body would want to adapt to make you more capable at facing that threat. But in the moment where you have that conflict shock, your body takes a screenshot, right, of everything in your environment. And your psyche's working not necessarily even through your literal physical eyes, but it's working through your psychic senses. That kind of ties to the word psyche. And so the thing that it takes in as the threat in that moment is somewhat random per se, or at least at this point, it's hard to understand why some things register as a threat and some things don't, right? And so, just for an example, in the case of mold, I thought I had really severe mold poisoning. I did tens of thousands of dollars of demolition on my house, this, that, the other to try to get the mold out. Turns out that mold was just present at the time of a conflict shock, and my body took a screenshot of that mold. It was one of the things in the environment. And so it associated it as a threat, right? And so then every time that there was a mold particle in the air, my body would think that I was in conflict again. So even though I'm not literally in conflict, there can be these triggers in our environment, and the triggers are not the cause. The food's not the cause, the mold's not the cause, EMFs aren't the cause. None of that stuff is. They're all just triggers that bring you back to your original psychological, spiritual wound, the conflict shock. And once you can resolve that conflict shock, then the triggers don't have an effect on you anymore. It's not going to disrupt you. But if you keep getting re-triggered over and over and over again, your body doesn't complete the healing phase. It keeps going back into conflict shock, or what GNM would call a hanging healing. Your healing's hanging, it's not ever fully completing. And so then your body's becoming more susceptible to the trigger, right? Instead of it being stronger and more resilient to the original conflict, it's becoming more and more susceptible to the trigger. You might even develop a second conflict. I did, because of the mold and everything I was going through. They also tried to say I had an inflammatory disease, a gut disease, a mast cell disease, all of the really fun ones, which they're always just coming up with new ones, by the way. You never want to listen to diagnosis too seriously. You want to do this healing work based on the symptoms. But I had a whole nother conflict shock based off of feeling alone, isolated, and all by myself, and dealing with the massive financial loss, the inability to work, and the extreme symptoms that I was experiencing while having mold. And so it just started to compound on itself. Second shock there, right? And just so you know, for more evidence, there was other people living in my house. Some of them were living in the moldy room. I actually lived upstairs and on the other side of the house. I was the only one that got sick. If you want to try to blame it on genetics, my son was also there, living right above the moldy room. Again, I was on the other side and he was totally fine because it's the conflict shock that causes it, not the trigger, right? And again, your psyche is what identifies the threat. It's what's taking the screenshot, bringing it in. And so, unfortunately, it seems as though even things like thoughts, feelings, um, all sorts of little subtleties can be the triggers that reactivate your conflicts that then keep you in illness, keep you in suffering, keep you stuck. And so you have to be able to be present with and inquire into the symptoms that you have to track them back to their source, resolve the conflict, bring it to from the subconscious mind to the conscious mind. Sometimes that's resolution enough. You're good to go because you've brought it to awareness and you see it in a new light. You realize that it's over with, it's done with. It doesn't need to be active anymore. You moved it from that old brain to the new brain and set yourself free. Sometimes that's enough. right? Just like I said, my process of inquiry, asking the question, who am I, brought me back to the origin of thought in a direct experience of who I am. Your symptoms, this grossest, most physical thing that you can experience, maybe the least exciting thing that you experience, you might be really frustrated with it. When you're present with it, you're not resisting it, trying to push it away, but you inquire into it. You get to take it back to its source. And in that is the resolution, whether that's perceptually, whether that's just from bringing it to your conscious mind, or whether that's the level of identity, the level of belief. That's where you go, okay, if this is what I had to believe about myself, what had to be true about me and my environment in order for this to be a conflict, in order for me to be in resistance to this and hurt by it, whatever, who would I have to believe myself to be or believe is true about the world in order for it to no longer be a conflict? And so you start to identify the old damaging beliefs that are really lies or misperceptions, and you identify what would be a positive 180 turnaround, a reframe of that belief. And you can ask yourself, who would I be without that belief? What would it look like for me to act, live, and be in a totally new identity than the one that was formed around this conflict shock? And so sometimes resolution is a practical step forward. Sometimes you do leave the boss. Sometimes you do separate from the danger. But it's really your ability to change as a person, to change fundamentally who you are, which again, this isn't a self-help thing. Who you are is already perfect, whole, lovable. You're perfect and as God made you, is the way that I like to say it. The changing fundamentally is letting go of who you're not. It's letting go of who you've believed yourself to be. That is the burden that's allowed you to be susceptible to these conflict shocks that then keep you stuck in illness and disease, right? And so I'll teach you later on how to do that sort of method of inquiry and how to find all these triggers and bring them back to their source to create really deep resolution. That's kind of the name of the game. And when you can be present with things as awful as symptoms, that's showing you that you can bring the spirit that you are, the wholeness of you, into even that. You can be totally present with it. You're not pushing it away. And that sometimes downgrades your symptoms. It downgrades your illness just right off the bat, just from making space to hear it, right? Because we're trying to find the higher purpose of what it's teaching you. And real quick, before I get into the more sciencey stuff, I do believe, and this is just my own take currently, I might update it, but I've seen a lot of really amazing spiritual teachers and beings that have a lot of illnesses and disease. And my current belief as to why that is, there's a few things, but one of them is that I believe this illness and disease, it's a message from your body showing you where you have divided from the wholeness of the spirit that you are, where you've divided from that eternal life, from that enlightened state, to keep it simply. And so it's kind of like they say in spirituality a lot, the suffering is your grace. Man, I don't know anything that's been greater suffering than the illnesses that I've had, the symptoms that I've had. That has taken me to my knees time and time again in such a painful yet profound way. And so being able to be present and go into them fully. You go from the grossest form of the body and it takes you to the highest form of the spirit that you are. It becomes this self-liberating process that you can go through. And why spiritual beings have more of those sometimes, I think it's because they're bringing more light, more of the light of who they are as a soul into their body. And so they're illuminating anywhere in which they're separate from that wholeness of who they are, right? Versus somebody who's kind of content living in that separation, that division. They've just accepted their biological programming. They've accepted their defense system. I know who I am. I know who the world is. My ego works for me. I'm making money. I'm doing good. I feel healthy, right? They're just stuck like that. And that's okay. Everyone's where they're at. Or those sort of people, they're in conflict active, which is the conflict is still active in their mind. It's still active in their system. It hasn't been resolved. So they haven't experienced the healing symptoms, which most people experience as illness, right? And then they get caught in that hanging healing where the conflict gets triggered and then they go through it again, right? But the people that just think they feel fine all the time, they never hit the healing phase at all. They didn't hit it, heal it, and complete it, and they're good to go. They didn't hit it, it got re-triggered, and started the pattern over again. So they experienced symptoms. No, they just stayed conflict active. They still just believe something about themselves or the world. They're still perceiving a threat. Sometimes I see people who make a lot of money and they have a conflict. I won't get too deep into what it is right now, but they have a conflict that happened that's put them in a lot of scarcity that causes them to have this constant search for more and more money. And it works for them because it propels them to keep earning, but sometimes they're still really unhappy, really stingy, and they're still conflict active. They're still in that state of scarcity, no matter how many millions that they have. I have several clients that are like that. Right. And so that's not really true happiness. That's not really living biologically aligned. It might work in the world in some ways, but it isn't necessarily true. And that's the tricky thing about healing and spiritual growth is sometimes when you're healing and you're coming back to that state of wholeness, you might resolve a conflict that has been working for you or where your ego has been set up in a way that you're surviving. It's working. I'm doing air quotes if you're just listening and not watching. Um, but you're not actually whole. You're not actually healthy. And so sometimes when you heal, you feel more symptoms, or it feels like your life isn't going as well as you want it to be. It feels like things are becoming harder temporarily. And that's okay. That's just part of the healing phase. And then once it completes, you start to be healed, whole, and your life aligns with this new person that you are. The new beliefs that come out of healing these are your new gift to the world. Right. For a while there, I was afraid that if I resolved some of my conflicts, I wouldn't be as intuitive. I wouldn't be able to read people or be as good of a healer or this or that. But in truth, resolving those conflicts, even though the conflict was part of my gift, it brought me here, resolving them is a whole new gift to bring towards the world, one that's even greater. Because it's coming from a place of wholeness. Your life starts to align with the truth of who you are. And so it feels right, it feels natural. It all works. But you got to get through that uncomfortability in those phases. And you got to actually fully resolve things too. If you just keep doing spiritual work that's bringing you into hanging healing, your life might just keep bouncing back and forth, feeling like it's falling apart or like you're getting symptoms, whatever. You got to really be able to resolve it, to move forward. And so that's where I started to find this thing called German New Medicine that I'm referring to as GNM. Um, that's the English pronunciation. It's GHK in German, which is a whole other word that I won't say because I can't. Um, but it's a framework for how this all works that helps you to understand the science of it, which empowers the power of belief, you knowing that your body works in a certain way and restores you back to wholeness and healing. That way you don't interrupt the process. If you're so conditioned by the medical society to view things in a certain way, then it's going to be hard for you to allow the healing and enlightenment process that is natural to you to unfold. Most of the constructs in this world are to keep you from your own natural state of enlightenment and state of healing and wholeness. Most of capitalism is based off keeping you sick, keeping you divided, separated, unhealthy. I hate to say it, but that's how I view it. Whether that be on purpose or whether that be on accident, there doesn't have to be a conspiracy around it. You could just say that's ego running the show. We don't need to get into that sort of ego mindset or conspiracy mindset with it, right? And so, anyway, Dr. Hammer, the guy who did all these case studies that showed no deviation, it was all tried and true. He gave us a map for A, how our body works, and B, how to interpret your symptoms in a way that show you your original conflict, that help you to be able to find it and resolve it. And so I see German New Medicine as being an amazing map, and I find intuition and inquiry to be the compass that then facilitates the true healing and restoration back to wholeness. I know this video has been kind of long. Let me just do one more thing here and then we'll wrap up. It's important to understand the 5 biological laws that Dr. Hammer discovered, because again, I'm a spiritual teacher and I want to bring you to freedom and enlightenment, but going through the body and the symptoms is one of the greatest ways to do so, to get there. One last thing before I introduce the laws is when I was in all of my illness for decades, I would see all sorts of medical intuitives on top of all the regular medicine stuff that I did, and they would have really good readings on where stuff was coming from, whatever, some of them, but they wouldn't know what to do about it. They wouldn't know how to resolve it, or they'd be so conditioned by the medical society or the alternative health society, naturopathic medicine, all of those, which still are not true to me. They're not the true framework through how to see things that helps for healing. So those readings didn't really do anything, right? And I found myself to be an amazing reader and able to see and read the core of what was going on with people and what was creating their personality quirks, their conflicts, what was keeping them stuck. But there was something that was making it harder for us to get real resolution and help them to undo that conditioning and truly break free. And this map of German New Medicine, it makes it all make sense. It makes it so that our intuition and our abilities, our modalities, whatever it is that we use, can actually work, or can work so much more. I was seeing pretty good results with people that I was healing and reading as it was, but adding German New Medicine, it made it so much more refined, so much quicker, and just made it a lot more powerful. So that's the framework I'm introducing to you. You can use it just to understand your own symptoms. You can use it for your own modalities, or you can use it just for an understanding of what I'm doing to help you if we work together one-on-one. So the 5 biological laws is the first biological law is that every disease or symptom originates from a specific conflict shock, right? I already talked about that one, so I won't go into it too much more. The second biological law is that every one of these, they call them biological programs because that's what they are. It's a program in your body that's trying to help protect you, right? Whatever psychosis you think you have, whatever mental, emotional thing you think you have, you're not crazy. Your body is responding in a totally reasonable way to a perceived threat or conflict in your past. It's just programming within you. If you feel totally compelled into a bad relationship or compelled into patterns that aren't serving you, that's fine. It's not something wrong with you. Take the guilt out of it. There's just a conflict that created a program that's running. All we have to do is understand them, be willing to look at them. Through our awareness, intuition, and this map, we can resolve them. And so the second law is that each one of these special biological programs proceeds in 2 phases. The conflict, or I'm sorry, the conflict active phase, as we've been calling it, and the healing phase, assuming that the conflict actually gets resolved, right? And in the active phase, individuals usually don't have as much symptoms. It's sometimes called the cold phase. And so there might be a little bit that's going on in there, which I'll explain more later on. And then there's the healing phase, which is where you experience the bulk of your symptoms. It's that restorative process that's happening. Your body's adjusting to repair what it had adapted to, right? And the nature of the conflict, the intensity of it, and the duration of the conflict, that will directly correlate to the symptom severity and duration. However, I believe that no matter how severe and long the conflict was, I think worst case scenario, it can only last for 8 weeks in the healing phase. Your body's gone through a complete, full restorative healing, no matter how long that conflict's lasted. For a lot of them, it's way shorter. It's an hour, it's a day, it's a week. And doing intuitive energy work is a really good way to downgrade or kind of work through that symptomology. I've resolved some pretty big things and had pretty mild healing phases thanks to this intuitive energy work that I teach in par with this. Third biological law, it outlines that the location of the physical symptoms corresponds with the embryonic, I'm not saying that right, but something close to that, embryonic, I can't say it, but development. So really it's linking specific origins to the regions of the brain that controls them, right? That's that thing that I was saying about the psyche, the brain, and the organ all um, being connected, right? And I could go into the science of it, but it doesn't really matter. It's just that tissues derive from these three different embryonic germ layers. I might have said it better that time. The endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. And I like to think of it as just, human evolution, and what parts of our brain evolved as, our biological makeup was evolving. Um, and so they govern different things, right? Different parts of the brain will govern different symptoms, different organs, different parts of the body. And so this map, it just helps you to be able to figure that out. Someone who knows German New Medicine, who studied it, like I'm doing now, uh, they'll be able to help you with that. You don't really need to know too much about that other than there is that correlation there, right? Fourth biological law is that microbes function as helpers in the healing phase, which represents a departure from the commonly held belief that they're pathogenic, right? So instead of viewing microbes as threats, we actually view them as playing an important part in our healing. And I find that really significant because I always thought that the microbes, the parasites, the mold, all that stuff was um, part of the illness. I thought it was the problem. I did so many thousands of dollars worth of detoxes to try to heal from that. And they're there to help your body. They're not hurting it. You know, some people often liken it to if there was a fire in someone's house, or many fires, in a neighborhood, and they say, oh, look, every time there's a fire, firefighters show up. The firefighters must be what's causing the fire. No, they're there to help put it out, to clean it out. Um, Same with these microbes, right? And so don't fear that. And there's a whole group of people that have taken this really far. They're like the primal community. They'll eat raw meat, raw eggs, raw whatever, because they think that that's the cure-all to symptoms. It's not. Been there, tried that too. I've tried all sorts of things, everything under the sun. But they do have some success because there is certain microbes that are present within that raw food. Um, Not so much in vegetables. Those kind of still need to be cooked, but in certain foods, basically farm foods, the microbes in there help the healing phase, right? So they kind of got some stuff right, that primal community, but they didn't get the actual root cause correctly. So anyway, just food for thought. And then the fifth law is one that asserts that every adaptation the body undergoes has a biological, meaningful purpose. The body's not prone to random chaos or failure. It's not working against itself. Nothing like that. It's all working in a way that's helpful for us. And I think they call this fifth biological law the quintessence. And they'll say that nothing in nature is meaningless or malignant. Rather, all diseases are part of a significant biological special program of nature that makes sense in the context of human development. Right? So those are the laws. And that's kind of the purpose of this work that I'm trying to convey and speak to help you have an understanding of the laws that we live under for our body. That way you can heal. So I hope this made a little bit of sense. Feel free to listen to it a couple times and feel free to email me if you have any questions. My email is brandon@brandonjwilcox.com. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.